Our scripture passage this morning is Daniel chapter 7. We're going to read verses 1 through 14. It says this: In the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Daniel had a dream with visions in his mind as he was laying in his bed. He wrote down the dream, and here's a summary of his account. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I was watching, and suddenly the four winds of heaven stirred up the great sea. Four huge beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. The first was like a lion, but had eagle's wings. I continued watching until its wings were torn off. It was lifted up from the ground, set on its feet like a man, and given a human mind. Suddenly another beast appeared, a second one that looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side with 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up, gorge yourself on flesh.' After this, while I was watching, suddenly another beast appeared. It was like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back. It had 4 heads, and it was given dominion. After this, while I was watching in the night vision, suddenly a 4th beast appeared, frightening and dreadful and incredibly strong, with large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed, and it trampled with its feet whatever was left. It was different from all the beasts before it, and it had 10 horns. While I was considering the horns, suddenly another horn, a little one, came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. And suddenly, in this horn, there were eyes like the eyes of a human, and a mouth that was speaking arrogantly. As I kept watching, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat, and his clothing was white like snow, and the hair on his head like whitest wool. His throne was flaming fire. Its wheels were blazing fire. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from his presence. Thousands upon thousands served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The courts were convened, and the books were opened. I watched then, because of the sound of the arrogant words the horn was speaking. As I continued watching, the beast was killed and its body destroyed and given over to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beast, their dominion was removed, but an extension of life was granted to them for a certain period of time. I continued watching in the night visions, and suddenly one, like a son of man, was coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was escorted before him. He was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, so that those of every people, nation, and language should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed." This is the word of the Lord.
It would help if I unmuted it, wouldn't it? There we go. Perfect. Yeah, great. Great start. Here we go. Daniel, it's perfect. We've got beasts, we've got all kinds of crazy stuff, and Robert's mic on mute. Perfect. Daniel 7. So we're in the middle of this sermon series, Lights in Babylon, and we have come to, I'm a preacher, so I say things like this all the time, but what might be one of the most important passages in Daniel, and maybe, I say this all the time, one of the most important passages in all of the Bible. And so you can just pray for me that I won't mess this up, because this one's really important, Daniel 7. Let me get us going this morning with a question. What is the highest court in the land? You can answer this morning out loud. What's the highest court in our land? That's what I thought. But it turns out that is not 100% accurate. For Americans, we would say, of course, that the Supreme Court, there's no higher authority, no other place we can appeal for justice. But it turns out that there is a court that's higher. I learned this week, and I just feel like I have to pass it on to you. If you go to the top of the Supreme Court building on the fifth floor, you'll actually find another court, a basketball court. I'm not making this up. There is a basketball court on the top of the Supreme Court building, and apparently the justices and their staff, they will do pickup games there, and I guess it's how they blow off steam during tough court cases. There's even a sign on the door that warns against bawling while court is in session. So no basketball or anything like that while the court is in session. This morning, Daniel 7 is going to give us a glimpse of a court even higher than that, of a court that stands far above the universe, far above the palaces and streets of Babylon, and far beyond Daniel and even our own time. God has given Daniel a dream in Daniel chapter 7 about the future of the world and the future of God's people. And this is the message of Daniel chapter 7. It's this: the verdict is in. The verdict is in. God exalts His people through the Son of Man. The verdict is in. God exalts His people through the Son of Man. Now, before we jump into just some crazy things in this vision in Daniel 7, I need to say to you a couple of things about the kind of literature that we're going to be reading from here forward in the book of Daniel. Daniel 7 is important, marks a turning point in the book. It's called apocalyptic literature. And if everything from Daniel chapters 1 through 6 is like reading a story, so this happened, then that happened, then that happened, that's how the progression goes. Everything in chapters 7 through 12 is going to be more like looking at a painting, like a piece of art. If you will, this morning, I want you to imagine that we have ascended to the 163rd floor of the world's tallest building, and there atop the world's tallest building, we find an art gallery. An art gallery that is full of windows, The paintings, the images from the paintings, they're going to fill us often with fear and dread. And out the windows, we can look and we can see the entire world stretch out before us. That's kind of how apocalyptic literature works. Like pieces of art, we're meant to stare at them, to look at them, to take in the color and the textures of the images, to even look for meaning behind the images, and to actually feel as much as we think about the text. But as I said, this is an art gallery full of windows, and we must not forget about the windows, because the paintings are actually telling us something about what's going on down there, 163 floors down in the world below us. So Daniel 1 through 6, we've seen Babylon through Daniel's eyes. We've seen Babylon through Daniel's eyes, and now in 7 through 12, through Daniel's visions, we're going to see Babylon through God's eyes. And do you know what God sees when He looks upon the great kingdoms of this world? He sees four beasts. Daniel's lying in his bed during the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign. So this is the guy that in the story of Daniel comes after Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel's having a dream. God gives Daniel a vision, and Daniel he saw the 4 winds of heaven stir up the great sea, and from it came 4 huge beasts. That's verse 3 of Daniel chapter 7. The first was like a lion. It had eagle's wings, but its wings were torn off, and it was made to stand upright on its feet. It was given a human mind. Can anybody say weird? Let's just all admit, that's really weird. The second beast was like a bear. It was like a bear raised up on one side with 3 ribs in its mouth. The beast was commanded. So God is commanding this beast to gorge itself on flesh in the vision. The third beast is like a leopard. but it had 4 wings on its back, and this leopard was given dominion, it was given control and authority. And then finally, a 4th beast appears. This is verse 7. And it's different than all the other beasts that have come before it. We might even call it a super beast, a mega beast. It's even more unnatural than all of the others. This beast was terrifying to Daniel. It possessed incredible strength. It had iron teeth and bronze claws. It devoured and trampled everything in its path. The angel tells Daniel down in verse 19. All of this terrified our prophet Daniel. And he didn't understand. Would you understand if you're lying there in your bed and all of a sudden you have this vision, this dream of these terrifying beasts? Of course, Daniel didn't understand. So in the dream, he actually goes to someone who is standing there, probably an angel. We don't know for sure. But he goes and he asks for an explanation. And I want you to notice what the angel, I'm assuming it's an angel, says to Daniel in verse 17. Daniel chapter 7, verse 17. These huge beasts, the angel explains, 4 in number, are 4 kings who will rise from the earth. Now, do you remember, if you've been with us the last several weeks, do you remember any other dreams about kings and kingdoms in the book of Daniel? Yeah. Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Did you notice in Daniel's vision here in Daniel 7 that there's some similarities between Daniel's dream and Nebuchadnezzar's dream? Right? It seems that, did you notice that the use of the same metals, iron is mentioned, bronze is mentioned in both dreams? It seems that the 4 kingdoms of Nebuchadnezzar's statue are actually the 4 beasts here in Daniel 7. And so, ultimately, what I think is going on here, what Daniel is teaching us, he's teaching us a hard reality of our fallen world. Genesis 1 teaches us that humans were created as God's image bearers, and we were actually called to rule the world on God's behalf. You can go read that. That's Genesis 1, 27 through 29. But when rulers like Nebuchadnezzar raised their hearts, you remember from Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar raised his heart in pride against God. When rulers like Nebuchadnezzar raised their hearts in pride to God, just as Adam and Eve did in the garden, humans and their kingdoms, human governments, whatever you want to call it, they become beasts. Violent, vile creatures. Instead of cultivating the world as God intended us to, as His image bearers, as those He's called to co-rule the world with Him, we become beasts. Instead of cultivating the world, we conquer it. Instead of pursuing peace and worship, as Adam and Eve were intended to do, we rule the world with power and violence. We can all point to modern day expressions of this, can't we? Where human kingdoms and human governments use their God-given authority to actually oppress people and make life difficult, especially for God's people. But oftentimes we look at these empires, maybe even our own nation, our own empire. We look at these empires and we're tempted to stand in awe, aren't we? To be impressed by them. We're tempted to maybe put our hope in those earthly kingdoms, to find our comfort, our hope for comfort in the security that a great nation even like ours offers us. But I think the point of all those beasts there in Daniel 7, or one of the points of them, one of the things that God is teaching us is that we may look at the kingdoms of the world this way, but God doesn't. In fact, God's not impressed at all. He's not impressed by the kingdoms of this world and the way that they rule His world with violence and oppression. We see strength, don't we? We see strength, even in the kingdoms, specifically in the book of Daniel. The kingdom of Babylon, the kingdom of Persia that's going to come after Babylon. We think of the Romans in the New Testament. We see strength. God sees beasts. Violent, vile beasts. We see the pinnacle of human might. God sees the perversion of the reign of His image bearers. We were intended to rule the world with God, friends, cultivating it like a garden, filling it with worship, filling it with beauty and peace. But instead, Adam and Eve and all of us, we tried to take God's throne from Him. We raised our hearts up in pride like King Nebuchadnezzar. We tried to take God's throne, to conquer His world on His own terms. I want you to listen to how the psalmist describes this reality, this relationship between God and the kingdoms of the earth. Psalm chapter 2, sometimes the Psalms are just great at capturing ideas from the Scripture that are hard to explain. Psalm chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. Listen to this. The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers conspire against the Lord and His anointed. Verse 4. This is how God responds to that. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord ridicules them. Our God, friends, He is not impressed by the kingdoms of this world. I want you to notice something else about these beasts, these kingdoms that Daniel sees rising up on the earth. I want you to notice how they seem to progressively get worse. So you've got the lion, you've got the bear, you've got the leopard. But it all culminates in this fourth beast. I told you we could call it a super beast, a mega beast. I think Daniel is teaching us something. God is teaching us something through Daniel about the trajectory of all of human kingdoms in human history. Humans have exalted their hearts against God, so we should expect that the kingdoms and the governments that we create, that they're actually only going to get worse. That things for us, brothers and sisters, are actually going to get a lot worse before they get better. An example of this from history that I find a little bit amusing. 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson was seeking re-election, and he promised a series of social and economic reforms that would usher in, this is what it was called, the Great Society. He dropped out of the race, and we're all still waiting on the Great Society, aren't we? Where is this Great Society? You see, brothers and sisters, Daniel's vision, the truth of God's Word, shatters any notion of a modern-day utopia. Brothers and sisters, we cannot vote. We cannot vote our way into a better world. We cannot legislate our way into a better world. Human governments, human kingdoms, they do not have the answer to solve the problems of our world. But we can. As followers of Jesus, we can vote our consciences this November, trusting that even as following Jesus becomes more costly and more difficult, as the kingdoms of this world progressively get hope, that our hope is not in Washington, it's not in any human government that has ever ruled upon the earth. Our hope is not there, because remember what I said, the point of Daniel 7 is that the verdict is in. God is going to exalt His people through the Son of Man. Not a human government, but through a divine government, through the Son of Man. Now, I told you there was a fourth beast, right? There are four beasts, and I told you that fourth beast is something most terrible of all. There is this fourth beast, and there are 10 horns. That's the next part of the Daniel 7 that I want to draw your attention to. It's the thing that really drives him to seek an interpretation of the vision in verses 19 through 22. And the angel tells Daniel that this fourth beast is different. Its might and its violence stretch out over the entire earth. From it, the angel explains, would come 10 kings represented by the 10 horns. If you go back and you read through the Old Testament, you'll find that the imagery of horns often points to this idea of power and authority. It's often used to describe kings and leaders. These 10 horns in Daniel's vision are followed by a little horn in verse 8. This little horn rises and it conquers three of the other horns, three of the other kings. It has eyes and a mouth that speak against God and oppresses His people. This This little horn, it's going to change religious practices and laws and for a period of time. And the angel says that God's people will be handed over to him. Verse 25. Now, I want you to hang with me for a minute. It's really weird, isn't it? This is weird, but hang with me. This is the vision. There are 4 kingdoms that rule the world with violence, but this 4th kingdom is going to be especially nasty. And one of its rulers is going to rise up against God and oppress his people. But don't be afraid, the angel says, because this is only temporary. This is only going to last for a certain period of time, because what's going to happen? You remember when we read Daniel 7? The court will convene. Now, we're going to come back to that in a moment. Things are going to get worse, but the court will convene. So what do we make of this 4th beast, and particularly these horns and that little horn? The 4th beast and these horns, they've been understood in 2 ways. I'm going to give you both of them this morning. There are some really smart people, a lot smarter than your pastor, really smart people who believe that what Daniel sees in these visions about particularly this 4th beast, the horns and the little horn, that it's all about the past. It's all about things that happened in history, some of it even before Daniel, right? The beast in this view represent a series of kingdoms, and the horns are specific rulers. In particular, the little horn in this view refers to a leader named Antiochus IV. All you need to know about him is about 150 years before Jesus comes on the scene, he did some really terrible things to the Jewish people. Some people believe, it is a legitimate understanding of Daniel chapter 7, that this is about that it's about this past king and these other past kingdoms. It's a legitimate interpretation. There are other really smart people who say the beast and the horns, they're about the kingdoms in the past, yes, but this 4th beast is about a future evil kingdom, and the little horn, a future leader known as the Antichrist, who will oppress God's people. And his arrival will mark the coming of the end and the arrival of God in the world. Now, I'm going to be really honest with you this morning. I'm not 100% sure which is correct. I'm not sure which is right. I suspect that neither of those interpretations is fully correct. That not even Daniel, I don't even think Daniel is given all that he needs to understand what God shows him in the vision of Daniel 7. But before we do that, before I tell you what I think the vision is ultimately about, I think there's a few points of application that we can make about this 4th beast, the horns, and particularly this little horn. The first is this, that you and I, brothers and sisters, as we live out our lives in this world, we should not be surprised by suffering. This past week, some of our pastors and staff, we traveled up to North Carolina to the Pillar Unite conference. We go every year, and there was a particular pastor there who told us of our Christian brothers and sisters in the northern part of India. He's weeping as he tells us the story, who are suffering, who are being persecuted for their faith. As I said, he's weeping. His voice is breaking as he's telling us. But Daniel's vision here seems to make clear that we shouldn't be surprised by those kind of things. We shouldn't be surprised by suffering, by opposition and persecution. We shouldn't be surprised when those in power, kings, presidents, governments, when like the little horn, when they seek to change culture and laws that prevent or make it more difficult for God's people to worship Him, we shouldn't be surprised by that. And we shouldn't be surprised if tomorrow or maybe the next day we find this opposition to and oppression of our faith getting worse than it was the day before. We shouldn't be surprised by suffering. Not only in Daniel, but in the rest of the Scriptures, this seems to be the trajectory that God is taking human history on. Now that's bad news, but it's not all bad news. Because not only should we not be surprised that suffering is here and that it's probably going to get worse before it gets better, we should also recognize, and I think we can take away from these images of these four beasts, that suffering is not without limits. That God has not allowed suffering and persecution to run amok in His world. Did you notice how Daniel's vision moves forward in a progression? One kingdom rises and the other falls, and the angel tells Daniel in verse 25 that the suffering and persecution of God's people, the angel actually says it's only temporary. I think this all points to the fact that God has set limits for the hurting and the suffering of His people at the hands of the wicked in the world. He's limited the suffering of His people in time. The hardship and the suffering of the church will not last 1 second longer than is necessary for God to accomplish His purposes in the world and in our lives. Not 1 second longer. And I think we can also draw an implication from the text that God has set limits for its severity. If we take all of the book of Daniel in context, we notice that Daniel and his friends have suffered, haven't they? They've suffered greatly. There are many others like them that don't get an account in the Bible. We don't get to hear about their suffering. But yet God preserves His people throughout the entire book of Daniel. God doesn't allow His people to be squashed, to be crushed. Suffering, persecution, yes, but not crushed. The suffering and persecution of His people are limited by the end to which God appoints it in our lives. God's using it for His purposes. He was doing something in Babylon. He used Daniel and put Daniel in the court of Nebuchadnezzar and used this boy from Jerusalem, right? This boy from Judah to influence the most powerful man in the world, to call him on his pride, to humble him, and to bring him to the place where he can actually give praise and worship to God. God is using the suffering of His people for His purposes. It is not without limits. It is not run amok in the world. The verdict is in, brothers and sisters. God exalts His people through the Son of Man. So we have four beasts, the fourth being a super beast, a mega beast. We have this little horn who would be this powerful ruler who will speak blasphemous things against God and oppress God's people. But that's not the end of the vision, is it? That's not the end of the vision. You see, that God is in complete control over all of this, over all the things that are going on in human history, has been demonstrated over and over again in the book of Daniel, and chapter 7 is no exception. It turns out the Supreme Court is not the only place with a higher floor that nobody knows about, right? It turns out that there's actually one more floor to that art gallery that I ask you to imagine, the one full of windows. There's actually a 164th floor. One more level higher in the vision of Daniel 7, where we find more fantastic images that give us a glimpse not of the world below, but of the heavenly throne room, where the judge sits on his throne. In the middle of all the beasts, in the middle of all the terror and the fear of these incredible beasts, Daniel sees thrones set in place. Then the Ancient of Days. Isn't that a wonderful name for God? It's a wonderful name for God. The Ancient of Days, the one older than time itself. The Ancient of Days takes His place. He takes His seat upon the throne of the universe, far above the world, far above these terrifying beasts that are wreaking havoc upon humans and God's people. The Ancient of Days is clothed in white like snow, and His hair like the whitest of wool. He's pure. There's no sin or imperfection in this one. He's holy and righteous. Did you notice the imagery of His throne? His throne and its wheels are ablaze with fire, and from his throne flowed a stream of fire. Now that's strange, isn't it? His throne has wheels. It's a chariot. It's a chariot. It's a chariot throne. The Ancient of Days is a judge on the warpath. And with fire, he's going to bring justice and destruction upon all who oppose him, upon all who oppose his people. The beastly kingdoms of this world are nothing in comparison to the Ancient of Days, to the thousands upon thousands that Daniel sees that serve him, and the innumerable. There's more than Daniel could count who are standing before his throne in worship. You see, no matter how powerful the kingdoms of this world may grow, no matter how fiercely they may stand in opposition to God and His people, it's the Ancient of Days. It's our God who is the judge. Did you know that's what Daniel's name means? Daniel's name actually means God is judge. But friends, aren't we often tempted to believe the opposite of that? I am. Don't we often carry out the work of the church as if we're the ones outmanned and outgunned? Don't we hear the stories of suffering and persecution and think, oh man, oh no, the church is losing ground? I'm tempted to think that. Don't we often operate as if we, the church, God's people, as if we have something to protect and defend instead of a mission to accomplish and a message to proclaim with a chariot-riding, flame-throwing judge on our side? When you put it in those terms, it makes who we are and what God has called us to do in the world, it puts it in a very different light, doesn't it? It makes those four beasts a lot less terrifying. Our God is the judge. The Ancient of Days is the judge, but that's not the end of the vision, because we actually know what this judge's verdict is. That's the whole point of the chapter. We know what this judge's verdict is. Daniel sees in the vision, he sees the books opened. Those aren't just any books. They're the books containing the deeds of all creation. And he hears the little horn, this powerful ruler, still speaking blasphemous things against God, still oppressing God's people, when suddenly out of nowhere fire pours from the throne of God. And the little horn is destroyed with fire, like that. The other beasts, which I assume are the 10 horns, they are judged as well, and their reigns are allowed to go on for a time. Once again, I don't fully understand what's going on here. I don't think you have to in order to understand the point being made. The point is that our God is the judge. Our God is the judge who sits enthroned high above every king and ruler, and one day He's going to open the books. And we know what His verdict will be. We know what His verdict will be. Actually, the angel told us. The angel told us in Daniel 7:22. These enemies of God, these beasts, these horns, they will only wage war against God and His, verse 22, His people, until what? Verse 22, until the Ancient of Days arrived. And a judgment was given in favor of the holy ones of the Most High. That's us, brothers and sisters. The judgment's in favor of us. For the time had come, and the holy ones took possession of the kingdom. Brothers and sisters, our God is coming to destroy the evil kingdoms and rulers of this world and to give power and authority to us. To us. You and me and all of God's people will one day rule the world with our Creator. We are not outmanned and outgunned. So brothers and sisters, don't put your hope in the kingdoms of this world. Don't put your hope in a future president and his or her policies, however it shakes out. Don't put your hope in the promises of the American dream. Don't put your hope in wealth or comfort or security and happiness or whatever this latest version of Babylon that we're all living in can offer you. No, even when suffering and hardship come, remember what Jesus told us. Remember Jesus' words in Matthew 6:33? Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be provided for you. Brothers and sisters, the verdict is in. God will exalt His people. And the last thing I want to show you this morning from Daniel chapter 7 is that He's going to exalt us through the Son of Man. The verdict is in, and God will exalt His people through the Son of Man. You see, when you come to that point in Daniel 7, the question that you have to ask is how? How in the world is God going to exalt His people? We just saw God, right? You remember the vision of God? He's holy, sitting on His fiery throne. Fire flows from it. And the truth, as good Bible readers that we're all painfully aware of, is that you and I, well, we're just like those beasts. We deserve judgment. We deserve destruction. You see, not only did Daniel see the Ancient of Days sitting on his fiery throne, but he saw another figure. He saw a Son of Man. Daniel 7:13. I want to read you the passage. I continued watching in the night visions, and suddenly one like a Son of Man was coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was escorted before Him. That's the answer to the question of how is our holy God going to exalt His unholy, unrighteous, undeserving people? How is He going to exalt us, the Son of Man? As Daniel looked, he saw a human ascending to the heavenly throne room and approach the Ancient of Days. Now we read that and we just blow right by it. We jump too fast to the New Testament and to Jesus. We're going to go there pretty quickly. But I want us to just settle for a moment on that idea that Daniel sees a Son of Man. That word just means a human. Daniel sees a human being rising on the clouds of heaven, entering the heavenly throne room and approaching the Ancient of Days, the God of the universe, whom no sinner can approach without being consumed. Daniel sees a human doing just that. But what human? What human since Adam has entered God's presence and lived? The answer is one. In Adam, all humans were condemned because of sin, but through the human that Daniel sees, they can live and be exalted. Did you know that the title Son of Man was Jesus' favorite title for Himself? He uses it over 80 times in the Gospels. In fact, I told you this morning that this might be one of the most important chapters in the entire Bible. Here's why. Jesus actually sees His entire ministry flowing from this chapter in the Old Testament. When He calls Himself the Son of Man, He sees Himself sitting in this role. In Mark chapter 14, as Jesus stood trial before the high priests who asked Him, "Are you the Messiah?" That's what they asked Jesus. Listen to what Jesus says to them. He says, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Does that sound familiar? Sound familiar? You see, I don't think the beasts and the horns, I don't think they're just about particular kingdoms and rulers in the past, or even particular kingdoms and rulers in the future. I think they're about all that. I think if we read Daniel 7 through Jesus' eyes, what we learn, what we take away, is that in every age, when human kingdoms exalt themselves above God, they turn into beasts. They oppress the vulnerable, and especially God's people, in order to exalt themselves. Think about what Jesus just said to the high priests. You're going to see the Son of Man the clouds of heaven. Isn't this exactly what the high priest and the nation of Israel have done? Haven't they exalted themselves above God as a nation? Isn't Jesus, in a sense, standing in front of a beast? I think he is. These men have raised their own interpretation of the law above God. They've oppressed the vulnerable, and here in Mark 14, they're about to kill God's only Son. And we could say this about them, we could say this about every nation, about our own nation, about any nation that has ever lived, that has ever existed on the face of the earth. When human kingdoms exalt themselves above God, they turn into beasts. And what Daniel 7 is pointing us to is that through Jesus, God is going to conquer them all. He's going to conquer all the beasts of this world. He will gather His own from every people, nation, and language. That's Daniel 7:14. He will exalt them to their rightful place, the place that Adam and Eve forfeited in the garden. And He will give to them a kingdom through the Son of Man, Daniel 7:22 through 27, that will never pass away. You and I, brothers and sisters, with God and Jesus, we're going to rule the world. That's the good news of Daniel 7. Jesus is the stone from Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2, and He is going to crush all other kingdoms. His kingdom will become a great mountain, filling the entire earth. But I don't think we can stop even there. Because if Jesus is to give us this future promise, there is another kingdom that has to fall. And it might not be the kingdom that you expect. I wonder if you considered as you were reading Daniel 7 this week that there is a beast in each of us. I mean, isn't it true? Can we all be honest with ourselves for a moment? That you and I build little thrones of pride in our hearts? That we exalt ourselves above God and one another? And like something out of a horror film, like werewolves in the moonlight, we become beasts? We rage with anger. We boil with jealousy. We yearn for greed, don't we? We yearn with greed. We burn in lust. We pine with covetousness. And on we could go. You see, brothers and sisters, the kingdoms of our heart must fall as well. The beastly, pride-filled kingdoms of our heart must be crushed too. But the good news of the gospel is that at the cross, Jesus actually conquers both. He conquers the beastly kingdoms of this world, and He conquers the beastly kingdom in our hearts. And He does it by losing. By laying down His life on the cross and rising 3 days later, He strips the beastly kingdoms of this world of their power. What do you do to a king that if you kill, he rises from the grave? What do you do? They've done their worst, but not even death can hold Jesus. By laying down His life on the cross and rising 3 days later, Jesus strips sin of its power over the hearts of His people. In Christ, you are no longer a slave to sin. He takes the punishment that we all deserved, and He dies in our place, and He grants to us the life we could never earn on our own. And then, in Daniel's vision, he sees this Son of Man ascend to heaven and sit down at the right hand of God, where Jesus waits for the day when the Father will send Him to once and for all destroy the beast forever and exalt God's people in an eternal kingdom. Our God is the judge, and the verdict is in. God exalts us through the Son of Man. His name is Jesus. This morning, I want us to celebrate that. It's kind of a scary chapter, isn't it? Beasts and horns and fire coming from the throne of God. But apocalyptic literature is intended to fill God's people with courage, with strength to face tomorrow. And so this morning, I want us to celebrate what God has done in the Son of Man and what He promises He will do by taking the Lord's Supper.